Hi everyone, this is just a quick message to say that David and I recorded two conversations. In this video, we're focusing primarily on his journey. So he's going to share with us how it all started from when he was a teenager, how he ended up with the TM community and learning meditation, and his first kind of pretty mind-blowing experience, and then all the way right up to Brahman. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to him and really enjoy this conversation is because he's not just speaking from direct experience, he's also really versed in this knowledge about the process of awakening and the different stages, and it's what his book is about. And he wrote a PhD about that. So it was really fascinating, especially for me to hear about Brahman and the post-Brahman stages and refinement, and just to see how differently even those stages play out and what they look like for different people, which is something I love because I just really enjoy seeing the diversity of different experiences, different ways people experience particular shift and particular stage, and so on. And in the next conversation, we're going to focus on dealing with trauma post-Brahman, which is not a topic that I don't think I have ever come across, to be honest. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this particular conversation with you. We're going to talk about how the trauma actually arose for David for the first time after the Brahman, and how he dealt with it, how he discovered the somatic work. And then we're going to talk about all the ways we can be suppressing, continuing to suppress emotions and kind of living sort of as if cut off from our bodies because of it, and how often even a profound awakening can at some point become a sort of a hiding place, and the way we bypass basically the things that we find uncomfortable. So I really hope that you're going to enjoy both conversations. Please remember to like the video if you enjoy the conversation, of course. It really makes a difference when you do that, because it just makes the video more visible in the ocean of all the other videos on YouTube. And also, please subscribe and share your thoughts and your experiences in the comments, and anything that resonate and about anything that resonated with you in those conversations. So thank you so much for watching. Take care. Hi, everyone. Today, I'm really, really excited to sit down with David Backlund to talk about his journey. He's a spiritual coach, and he's also an author of an incredible book, which I'm halfway through, I must admit. It's called Our Natural Potential Beyond Personal Development, the Stages of Enlightenment. Hi, David.
Hi, Maggie. Nice to be here.
I actually realized that I saw you here and there for quite some time, but it was, and I actually got your book ages ago. I just didn't connect the dots, and it was just on the list of the books that I've always wanted to read. And then recently, I came across a conversation between you, Susanna, and a gentleman whose name I unfortunately can't remember.
John Rogers, yeah.
John Rogers. Hi, John, in case you're watching. Hi, Susanna. Um, and um, and I was just sitting there, just so happy to hear people talk about what happens post Brahman and how different the human expression is of, and what people encounter and what they experience. And then I ended up on your blog, and I saw this little exchange with another person, and finally someone was like talking about this specific stage as something that is actually more and more common, and talk about the kind of human aspects also after that stage.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just a little mention that one of the things that's good to understand about this spiritual unfolding is that there is a common underlying process in the stages of enlightenment, but there's a lot of subjective variation in that. And some of that will depend on the kind of practices we use, but also just our temperament and traits, the kind of orientation we have to it, and a bunch of other things will influence the process. So what I've been exploring for a while is the different variations, but what is the underlying process behind that? And I sometimes use the analogy of puberty because we all go through the process of puberty, but there's a lot of subjective variation in the way it's experienced. Some people have very simple, easy process. Some people have a little more challenges and drama.
Yeah.
So the process here, that began in my late teens. I was reading about brain physiology, the newer brain research, right side, left side of the brain, and that kind of thing. This is back in the 70s. And they were talking a little bit about consciousness and meditation in there, which I knew nothing about. So I was curious, and then I saw a poster advertising a talk on transcendental meditation. It was very big at the time, quite widespread, being taught quite in a quite widespread way. And so I went to a talk, and they had scientific research on the practice. It sounded interesting, and it was relatively inexpensive then, and so an easy decision to give it a try. And to my surprise, very first meditation, I had a deep transcending, which is not something I'd remembered ever experiencing. And it was, it was very peaceful and so on. And I was somewhat of an anxious person then, and so it was really beautiful uh, relaxation. So I got really interested in it. I went to talks they had, and they had some classes and so on like that. And then got to a point where the next thing to do, if I wanted to learn more, was to go on their teacher training program to learn to teach meditation. And so, less than a year after I learned to meditate, I was off to France, and off-season hotels they used for teaching teachers. And it was quite a process. We did a lot of extra meditation and yoga and such in what they call rounding cycles of practice, and did a whole lot of memorization, which was an interesting contrast. Try to focus when you're not focused, um, and I did a lot of for the first. It was 6 months basically a 6 month retreat, and so the first half I did a lot of purification and a lot of anxiety. And I remember, trying to do the memorization while I was pacing in the hallway, and because of all this energy that was releasing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to have these little sporadic experiences of what's known as witnessing. And witnessing is when you shift from being a person in some way, like being in your head or in your emotions, or however you're oriented to being a person, uh, shift back into being an observer of the person. It's kind of like you step a little back and out, and you're kind of watching, not visually, but in consciousness, you're kind of watching the body, and it continues to do its stuff. And so we thought before that I was the doer, but now you're just watching the doing. It's a kind of curious experience at first.
Well, thank you for explaining in the first place for anyone who might not
Mm.
know what's that
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's closely related to kind of to what people call presence, just being in
Mm.
this detached kind of way of observing, although there's kind of degrees of it. Um, won't get into that at this point, but this kind of went, came and went a few times. And then in the second part of the retreat, see if I remember the sequence here. I was doing yoga on the floor, facing down, and suddenly I had this white, bright white flash that kind of blew out all my perception. And as my perception came back online, I could see through the floor, through the wall on the room below, and out onto the grounds. And it was kind of like, well, that's weird. I'm facing down and I'm seeing through the floor. Um, and kind of like, wow,
Very
that's
cool.
sort of flashy experience. And it stopped pretty quickly. And
Did you freak out or not?
no, no, just it was a bit of just some unusual thing.
Mm-hmm.
You some clearing, is kind of the idea. But there was no framework for it that I had at the time. for what the experience was. But it was like, okay, some bit of flash, and it's gone. So I got up, finished my yoga, and got up and sat to meditate and that. But what I realized after that was that the witness was full time, and it's never stopped since. Much later, decades later, a friend of mine had a book called Kundalini Vidya. It's about the Kundalini process in some detail. Um, and in there's a point just above the third eye called Makara. And essentially, if the Kundalini reaches that point, it stops going up and down. And so the witness becomes stable. And it's very short distance between there and the crown and Bindu and awakening. But in my case, it paused there for 30 years.
Wow.
And so what I had was an identified ego and a witness. So it's kind of like this duality of experience. I mean, usually witnessing comes along with awakening or somewhere in that. But in this case, it came early. And for the first few days of it, I was hyper vigilant because it was just, really interesting. Like I was watching my body fall asleep, and then it's like, when your body goes to sleep, the body is stilled in a deep sleep, and so you can't move your arms and legs and stuff like that. Once in a while, people have gained some alertness during sleep and they can't move and kind of freak out a little bit. Basically, they just stepped into an observer, and the body naturally stopped moving in deep sleep. And then going into dreams, and I could go in and manipulate my dreams and this kind of stuff. But then I kind of realized at a certain point that, I didn't need to manipulate my dreams. That's not what they were for. And observing sleep meant that I wasn't actually fully asleep, because there were some senses were active. So I wasn't actually sleeping in a normal kind of way. But it was a bit like meditating 24/7, because that consciousness was awake. But the key part was it was awake inside, but it wasn't awake to itself. It was awake to the person, but not to itself. And so it wasn't an actual awakening. It's kind of like a half awakening, or not even that. But it was there. And then that space basically created the circumstance for me to start having way more subtle perception. And so I think it was about 10 days later, I had my first, what I refer to as a cognition. That's the way they're described. It's a type of experience where the entire experience comes all at once. So, it's like everything. So, for example, if I cognize this pen, like when I'm experiencing it right now, I'm seeing one side of the pen and just the way it is right at this moment. But when you cognize it, you see all sides of the pen. You see its entire history and everything it's made of, and the whole thing. It's like this complete download of information. In my case, this was the experience of what's known as Hiranyagarbha, or the golden egg, which is what the universe looks like from the outside. So it's basically how the universe is created and the way it expresses. So that took months to unpack by the mind, because it's like the mind can't comprehend it on that level. It has to be then processed by the mind in an increment, in a linear kind of more way.
And you were still so young.
Yeah. It was a surprise. And then there was a whole bunch of other stuff. And over the next few years, there was a kind of a progressive deepening, where did the egg come from, and so on like that, going up basically as far as I could go with that level of development, which was kind of a little backwards. Like some people will start, with being able to see energy, and then they'll go a little deeper, and then they'll, be able to see the celestial, and then they'll go down to like this kind of progressive deepening, where I kind of jumped in deeper, and then I've gone backwards up through more since then. It's curious. So everybody's process is a bit different. But in any case, at the end of the course, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi came to make us teachers, and we had a chance to talk to him, and a few of us anyways. And And so I got a chance to talk to him about it, and he verified my experiences and said there would be much more, which turned out to be somewhat of an understatement. But then I came back home and made some attempts at being a teacher, but it was really hard to support myself that way. I'm not much of an entrepreneur, and promote self-promotion and that. Um, and also I had other kinds of karma that wasn't going to be resolved well, that I see now, that wasn't going to be resolved very well through that. So very gradually there was a deep progressive deepening of the experience, but very gradually there was a more outward shift, and I ended up, I got married and I had started a family and did the career thing and that. So there was kind of a shift from being very inner directed to being more outer directed. And I continued to meditate and all that through the process, but it wasn't central to the attention anymore. And lived my life that way for a long time. There was other things would unfold here and there, like I had a phase in the mid 80s when past lives started to show up, and because there was a strong thing here, like, because the kind of work I was doing didn't make any sense. I was out of my element temperament wise, and yet that was kind of where life was pushing. But it was karmic basically, and so some past life memories started showing up, which made sense of my life basically. And there was a bit of a driver there for that to happen. But skip forward a bunch of years, and then in the mid 2000s, I was working in tech. I co-founded a .com startup, and in that whole thing, and so had been designing software and
well done you for not being entrepreneur and everything. That's
yeah,
really
but I was the
cool.
tech guy. I wasn't the entrepreneur. There was my
Right,
co-founder, my
right.
partner was the one that was the
Got it.
Yeah, and so I did the design the software and then hired developers and all that kind of thing. And that, but it was kind of this thing where we figured if we worked really hard for 6 months or a year, we'd have a $1 billion business on our hands. But no, that wasn't the path it went.
No.
So several years in, still having to work really hard, and the basic stuff was making money, but there was this potential for so much more, and we kept, our president kept on trying to bring it out into a larger market, and we spent a lot of money on trying to expand our markets, but.
Was this the time of this like internet boom kind of a thing?
Yeah, exactly. The
Right.
dot-com boom.
The
Yeah,
dot-com
so
boom.
I mean, it was a great idea, but we were working in the construction industry, which was not an industry that adopted new technology very quickly. So it was long sales process. Our sales reps would go and talk to them, repeatedly over a long period of time, and then finally they would adopt it partially, and then the project manager would move to another company, and we'd have to start all over again.
Right.
It was a bit of a, anyways, that's part of the drama. But anyways, the work hours were taking a toll on my marriage, and my attempts to change things weren't helping, and so I decided to step down. And but anyways, the life I was leaving then all kind of fell apart and went away. My marriage and the career and the my home and all this sort of stuff. And so
Wow.
I kind of reevaluate where I'm going with my life, and I ended up reconnecting, so through a series of fluky kind of things, reconnecting with a bunch of old friends from the 70s, and spirituality kind of rose back up in my uh, awareness, and went to a few satsangs, and then somebody I'd known from back in the 80s, I found out was teaching, had woken up and was teaching, and but he was just in a local area in another city, and but then he started doing a conference call thing, and eventually I was able to connect with them. They went to a technology that I could use too, and listening to him. It was quite funny too because he was calling on his cell phone into a Skype connection, and then we were daisy chaining the Skype to we didn't have Zoom in those days. Daisy chaining the Skype to listen, and half the time, he was on a farm in the middle of nowhere on the prairies, and so half the time I couldn't even hear him because he talked so quietly and there was so much line noise and stuff. But it didn't matter. I woke
Mm-hmm.
up listening to him and
Wow.
sitting there listening, and it's sort of like finally, and it was just such a really simple thing, but because I had studied this stuff so much, I had all these concepts about what it was going to be like or whatever, and but nothing to do with that. So when I woke up, I didn't even know what it was because it was like, didn't meet my concepts of it. But after
Yeah.
about a day and a half of it, it became really clear what it was to my surprise. And what was funny too, and then that weekend I had several social things, and several people noticed the change in me, um, which was really interesting. I didn't expect that. And they talk when you first learn to meditate to notice if other people notice changes in you, but I didn't
Mm-hmm.
expect the shift because it was something inner. And it was somewhat, it's like I went to this social thing, and I walk into the room, and this woman I know, she's in the middle of a conversation. She stops mid-sentence and looks up at me and says, "What the hell happened to you?" And so, of course, everybody turns and looks at me.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
incredible.
yeah, it was funny.
And what did you say? How did you
I didn't,
explain
I didn't say,
yourself?
I didn't say anything, and then we kind of ushered her over into the corner, and we had a little conversation about it. Um, yeah, another friend of mine said, "Oh, I thought I'd fallen in love." And I said, "No." He said, jokingly, he said, "Oh, you must have woken up then."
Oh my God, that's
It was pretty
hilarious.
funny. Yeah, but of course, there's a pattern that Adyashanti talks about that where there's can be a bit of honeymoon at first, and then
Mm-hmm.
you've created this open space in consciousness. The self has woken up to itself. Now, that's another important point here. It's not that David woke up; it's that self woke up to itself through
Yeah.
body mind. We don't. You never wake up.
Yeah.
That was one of the concepts that I was surprised to realize, um, and where it wasn't very accurate. And so then, kind of creates this open space, and so what's unresolved comes forward to be processed in this space, and
Yep.
it's much easier to process
Yes.
now because you're in a wit, detached, from it. So you can just watch it go by. You don't get caught up in it in the process, but there can be a lot. And so, yeah, I did lots of processing for a little bit there. But I think probably because of the long witness that had already been there, the next couple of stages came pretty quickly. It was about 2 months late after I woke up, the heart opened. Now, just understand here, the heart is there's a physical heart, but there's also an energy center, and that energy center has what's called anahata chakra, the heart chakra, which is opens with the rise, but then there's with after awakening, there's then a descent. Essentially, the idea is that Shakti rises to join Shiva in the crown, and then the two descend together. And when it reaches the heart, a higher octave of the heart, Hridaya, can open. This is where you get universal love and compassion and that kind of stuff. So that
Yeah.
blasted open for me. And I realized there was kind of a crust on the heart to protect itself. But once you're established in being with awakening, there's that potential for the heart to open as well.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Triggered a lot of refined perception, like the experiences of the world being immersed in golden light and sort of the colors of objects being muted by all the gold, and just a lot of bliss. Um, yeah, Gangaji came through Vancouver that year, and got a chance to see her, and she told me I was a fountain of bliss. That's pretty funny. There was this one time where I was sitting on the floor and near the front, waiting for her to arrive, and there was three of us that were just laughing and laughing and laughing, just ridiculous laughing. And this woman who was sitting on a chair behind me, she fainted and fell onto my back and and that, and just she was just blasted by all the bliss. Uh,
Oh my God.
it
And
was
no one smoked anything. I
uh,
was wondering whether someone was
no,
like
no, it was.
accusing you of smoking something
Yeah,
or
no,
yeah.
it was really nice in that sense. And then about 2 months after that, and there was, oh yeah, the other part was like there was this kind of like a fire hose of love just pouring out, and so the it was kind of it started a devotional period for me. I'm more analytical than devotional, but it became devotional, and basically I was seeking an object for the love to flow to, and
Mm-hmm.
it was single. And now some people they have an orientation towards the divine, that they
Yep.
flow to the divine. Some people have an orientation towards their teacher. They flow their devotion to their teacher. And then some people, like myself, that's what they call the upaguru, which is essentially one's partner or mate, becomes the object of devotion. And now, in my case, I didn't have a partner, and so a friend that I respected became the stand-in for that period, and I kind of blasted her with love for a little bit. Um, and we went through this kind of strange dynamic. Is this a relationship or is this not a relationship?
Yeah, I was just thinking that must have been pretty not just intense, but like pretty kind of confusing.
Yeah, yeah. So it was we were not well suited to each other as people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as friends, fine, but as people. But we had a strong resonance. Like when we
Yeah.
sat together, it amplified the silence for both of us. So there was a strong resonance there, and so she became a natural vehicle for that. And I've since seen the similar thing happen with a few other people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in one case, that I was their object to flow to um, for that period of time. And
Right.
about 2 months later, the unity shift happened, and that was kind of interesting because sometimes it just clicks over. But for me, there was a couple of pre-stages that were obvious. There's a process that Adyashanti refers to as head, heart, gut, and they're also referred to as the Dantians or the Mahamarmas. They're kind of three of the centers that are particularly prominent and each of them has an identification. So there's the loss of the head with awakening, the head identification, and we have all these self concepts and narratives and all that kind of stuff, which break apart after that if we
Mm-hmm.
process. And then there's the heart opening, which is the potential. Sometimes it doesn't happen until later. And then there's the gut opening, also the release of what's known as the core or existential identity, and it has a strong association with one's name. So it was an interesting period. So there's a loss of that core identity first,
Mm-hmm.
and the sense of David went away, and personal pronouns became meaningless because there was nothing, there was no personal there in that kind of sense. Um, and and then I noticed there was no longer an inside and an outside. It was just a continuum. I hadn't really noticed the difference before, but it became obvious when it was no longer there. And then I went on a retreat, and with the teacher I woke up with, and one evening during the retreat, I went to bed, and the entire, like I described, having those experiences of the structure of the universe and the creation before that, and so on, and that's basically once that stuff opens up, it's just there all the time. You can just refer to it. It's like, memory is a bad example, but it's just kind of there in the experience. It's just part of what's here. And
Mm-hmm.
like I can look over there and see the door. It's just there when I put my attention on it. And that all disappeared. And it was kind of like a reboot. And so I was lying there in a dark room, sharing a room with someone else on the retreat, and I'm looking around and I'm seeing the world is still here, and yet it feels like it's gone. And then the shift happened, and I didn't, it wasn't quite, it was very subtle. It wasn't quite obvious, but it was kind of funny. The next morning, I was helping on the retreat a little bit with where people were sitting. Um, the teacher would organize the room so that certain people would be up front that he would speak to for that meeting, and then, like that. And I was helping people find the appropriate seats. And he arrived in the back, took one look at me, and rearranged the room, and had me sit right up front to describe my experience, which I had not talked about yet at all, or even processed with the mind really. And so it was like, yeah. but
That's incredible.
but yeah, there was a joke made about the person formerly known as David, uh, and because that was around the time Prince had done his thing, and but I was, I don't know, took a few weeks, and then kind of the things integrated more, and then I started to be able to use personal pronouns again, but it didn't mean the same thing anymore. It was a
Yeah.
reference to the function as opposed to the sense of self.
Yeah.
And so unity is a little different in that it has kind of sub-stages. And they're described a couple of different ways in the old text, but I've not found them that orderly. But essentially, there's this process of experience and become. And it's a process of the intellect. Essentially, we experience something, and the intellect recognizes that is the same self as this in here. So I can talk about the dynamics of consciousness briefly here. It'll explain it a little better. Essentially, consciousness has curved back on itself and become self-aware. So there's an observer aspect, there's an observed aspect, the world of experiences, and then there's a process of experience between them. When we wake up, it's the observer that wakes up first. And then in unity, we recognize that the world is formed in a field of consciousness. Now, we may not relate to that right away, but as it deepens, we can see that. So it's as if the world plays out on a screen of consciousness, and we recognize that consciousness in back here or whatever is the same consciousness as that screen, and the two of them kind of come together into one wholeness, leaving just the process of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this kind of progressive wholeness, and as we experience things in our life, we progressively it gets added included. The Brahma Sutra describes it as the aggregate. There's this growing series of recognitions, and at first it's the first level of perception. What we focus on, we recognize as the self, but everything else is not. But it gradually expands out to include more and more, and it goes back into memory, and even goes into what the one of the old texts calls even the universe beyond perception, outside of perception, but it's still in consciousness, and so it's still in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So it all gets progressively included. And then partway along in there, the refinement process that was going on in God consciousness, the heart opening part, it kicks back in again. And then there's a refinement process going on. And so there's other layers of what I had experienced before. Well, the stuff I had experienced before that went away all came back again, but now in a new context. And then there was a progressive refining. So other kinds of things started to become part of the experience. Like there's a thing they refer to as the cosmic body, which is essentially the body of all bodies, all simultaneous. And there's a bit of that in chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita when Krishna shows his true form. And then, so there was a bunch of refinement. There's also something called the Devata body, which is kind of an interface between the cosmic body and the world of experience, where the Devata, which are part of the process of experience, are creating all the forms and all the experiencers and the experiencing, all the process of experience, all experiences. Because essentially the world, you come to realize that the world is here as a way for consciousness to know itself. And we're all distinct people. There isn't just one experiencer. because to know itself in all of the detail, we have to have a whole bunch of different perspectives. So there's all these different experiencers having different perspectives of the one whole. And each of us experiencing adds our experiences to the whole. So we're all part of the, we're all part of the whole and part of that process. So there's a progressive deepening and a whole series of layers. I can remember in that period, there was kind of like, what's real today? Because the sense of reality had shifted again. Not like a whole stage change, but just these little shift and little shift and little shift. And it became very, what's new today kind of a thing, because it was all, what did it now include? And there's, variations in how that unfolds, and it depends on how much refinement is going on as to what people notice. Some people go from awakening to unity, and they skip the refinement part in the heart. And because there's kind of like there's the three stages in our relationship with consciousness, and then there's corresponding stages in refinement, and then those continue a little further afterwards. Anyways, so that went on for about 3 years. And then my life kind of went through this interesting transition, and because I was doing tech consulting after that, but it was being progressively less supported, and but I wasn't sure what else to do, and finally let it go and just started writing, and then I got supported and ended up going to grad school and in the States and so forth, which really helped inform the book. While I was down there, another shift took place, and there's some variation in how it unfolds, but essentially, consciousness comes to know itself fully, in so much as it's going to in this form, and then, but it's always been looking in on itself, like I was showing. But we've been looking in on it. Consciousness has been looking at itself. All the world of experience, everything is all the self. But then, once it sees itself fully, it can kind of turn and look past itself. And it's very difficult to describe what's beyond consciousness, because the whole field of experience is in consciousness. And so when you go beyond consciousness, you're beyond experience. So there's no senses, there's no experiencing, none of that. But there are these subtle qualities. And essentially, consciousness is what was having the experiences, but beyond that is what's known as Brahman, which means the great. And it's essentially a no thing, because it's beyond experience, beyond any objective experience, beyond any senses, beyond any of that. It's simply Brahman knows itself. So you become Brahman to recognize Brahman. Now, for a lot of people, the shift into Brahman is very distinctive. You go from being everything everywhere to being nothing, nowhere. It's not emptiness, because that's a quality of space, which is a quality of consciousness.
Yeah.
It's beyond that. And what sometimes happens for people is what they first experience is primarily the loss, what was there. But as they sit with the experience, well, the experience is the wrong word, but as they sit with it, they begin to realize the more subtle Brahman that's there. And then Brahman comes to know itself. And then there's a refined Brahman stage where these subtle qualities are recognized. They're not manifest, they're not expressed in any way, they're just there. And one of those qualities is alertness. And so the most subtle value of Shiva is that alertness, which is what leads to the witness and the observer aspect of consciousness. And there's also this quality of liveliness, which, and the liveliness, that liveliness becomes Shakti, the energy, the movement, the flow. And the liveliness stirs the alertness, and it becomes conscious. And there's also a quality of intelligence in there. So it takes an intelligent direction, and it recognizes itself. And that begins the whole process of consciousness. It's kind of like the origin of consciousness. Although to say origin is a bit misleading because there's no point in time when it starts. It's because this is all
Yeah.
before time. Because time is a part of the process of experience which arises in consciousness. So when you're talking about the beginning of consciousness, it's before even the beginning of time. So it's kind of
It's almost like this is the point at which all words and concepts basically fail.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to describe, and it can sound kind of, and it well, actually it's not unusual. I've met several people who kind of come to the doorway of Brahman and kind of start to step through the doorway and they pull back, and they start to step through and they pull back because they don't want to lose unity, because unity is pretty, especially refined unity, is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Um, to being everything everywhere, and anyways. Um, a lot of nice qualities, that a lot of knowledge, and whatnot in that. But Brahman is actually, well, it's called the Great or the Supreme. It's um, pretty amazing. And then the interesting thing about the refined Brahman is, which won't happen if there hasn't been a refinement process, particularly before that. This refined Brahman isn't really going to show up. So the things like the qualities that become consciousness, that's not going to show up.
Mm-hmm.
Also, when you're in awakening, and your self-realization, and in unity, you experience confident consciousness as infinite and eternal. The idea there's something before it seems ridiculous, but then there it is, and then there's these subtle qualities in it, and that kind of leads you into where those qualities come from, and that's sort of the final stage, if you want to call it that, of the process, which is referred to as pure divinity or parabrahman, and para
Mm-hmm.
beyond or supreme, depending on your orientation. So that's where we can loop back here. If there's no refinement process, then Brahman is the endpoint for the process. Whereas the refined Brahman and parabrahman can unfold from that. If there's potentially. So then there can be that distinct shift from unity into Brahman, and then Brahman into para-Brahman. And pure
Mm-hmm.
divinity is just like divinity only. There's nothing, it's essentially it's pure light, and these very fine qualities in it. And it's has a lot of people relate to it as a feminine, subtly feminine kind of thing, because there's love and care, and that kind of sense in there as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
So there's the kind of process where it's an endpoint. There's a process where there's a distinctive shifts. And then there's a process where when there's more refinement, more than most people, but there are a few people who turn out to have this level, where it's like unity becomes Brahman. There isn't a distinctive break from being everything everywhere into Brahman. It's like everything everywhere comes to include Brahman. So it's like Saguna and Nirguna, with qualities and without qualities. And then unity comes to be seen as sort of similar to Brahman, except it's with Brahman qualities. And then para-Brahman becomes supreme Brahman. It's not a separate Brahman. It's just part of this continuum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was not the experience here, but I now know a couple of people who have gone through the process that way. And interestingly enough, one of them did it a long time ago, decades ago, and which is interesting because usually the further back you go, the less of the refinement is there, because
Yeah.
there was much more density in the collective, so it gets harder to have that level of clarity.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's so many people who've woken up, and many of those people who've woken have gone through some of these further stages, and so it gets easier for everybody the more people that awaken. And then there's also a process going on where more and more people are supporting more and more. And that's an important thing to note about this too, because one of the things that's happening with this its consciousness is waking up to itself through all these people, but we all have the same consciousness. And so it's lifting all boats. And one of the things that's doing is it's pushing what's unresolved to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And so if people don't have an understanding of processing their emotions, they're all still suppressed or whatever, then what ends up happening is people kind of act out, or they get into irrational fear, and you see all this stuff with conspiracies and all that going
Yeah.
on. But at the same time, there's also a purification of organizations taking place. So there is stuff being revealed that has been suppressed for a long time. So there's a whole lot of dynamics of things, and truth becomes this kind of very vague thing. But it's part of the process of purification. It's not that everything's falling apart. It's that we're going through a major transition in collective consciousness, and so there's a lot of purification happening. It's kind of like, I mentioned before about awakening, having a honeymoon, and then having all this stuff that's not been processed yet coming to the surface. And
Mm-hmm.
if we've done our work, then that's a smoother process generally. But it's not like we control our process in that sense, and so sometimes awakening happens sooner, and then we have more to unpack in the follow up. So it's quite a fascinating journey, and the sort of making that shift, and then there's kind of a pattern too. There's the awakening God consciousness unity process, and then there's a similar thing with Brahman, refined Brahman, parabrahman, and the pattern is somewhat similar. And so again, in parabrahman, there are stages. So there's the first integration of the parabrahman itself, this first initial experience, and there's this tendency for the divine basically to flow into the energy body and then into the physical. So there's kind of this embodiment process that happens that's quite a bit more overt with pure divinity. And and that for here there was some really remarkable stuff started happening collective wise, and then it started a whole other process for me in my life.
Which we're going to continue.
Yes, we'll talk about
Stay
our next
tuned.
conversation.
Stay tuned. Um, yeah, definitely stay tuned for our next conversation, because it's one of the things that I kind of learned as I listened to people and read the books and so on, that there's like this general perception that after that stage, especially after Brahman, let's call it, post Brahman, that like nothing else arises, because like you couldn't possibly deal with trauma or anything somatic, because obviously there's no body, and
Yeah.
blah 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 blah. So quite honestly, I think this is one of the reasons why I felt such joy when I saw your conversation with Susanna and John, John, right?
Yes.
Because you were like, I don't think so.
Yeah. No, I
My
thought that myself,
experience.
because there was
Yes.
some of the teaching was that even with awakening, you were stress free, but yeah, no.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and then I've seen people in Brahman have major issues surface. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is we came into this body with our suitcase of seeds of karma, which have started sprouting, and they're going to continue unfolding throughout our life, irrespective of if we're awake or not. I mean, being
Yeah.
awake means it's a lot easier because we're not getting caught up in them the same way, but they're still going to unfold. There's still stories, like Tatwali Baba, he was shot um, uh, by this guy as his final karma. And he told his students several days ahead of time that it was going to be happening. He knew it was coming, but it was still his karma to be experienced. And there are some things I found that in the process of purification and healing, I found there's some things you can address on the energetic level. Like what I found was at first, stuff would surface and express, and it's like, oh, some drama would be there with the emotions or whatever, and then gradually there started to be the ability to catch it as it was starting to rise, and so then I could process it on that level and not have it fully express into emotions and events in my life and that kind of thing. And then
Yeah.
even deeper, just the first seed of it coming up could be resolved. But then there's other ones in there that are entangled with other people. It's not just our seed; it's other. It's there's people. Other people are with it, and so those still have to be acted out in the life. We can't do those solo. That
Yeah.
my experience yet, anyways.
Yeah. So this is great. So I think maybe in the next conversation we can focus on how I mean, I will mostly want to hear, about your journey with your somatic work and how you even came across it and how illuminating that was, at given where you're at. Because I honestly, I couldn't stop. I couldn't actually believe as I listened because literally round about the same time that I saw your conversation with Susanna and John, I was just completely amazed as to what was going on because I discovered a modality called fascia release or myofascia release. But I went purely for my injury. I didn't go for healing or dealing with trauma or whatever, contractions in my nerve, nothing like that. And I was completely blown away as to what unfolded. But I'm gonna keep it to our next conversation.
Yeah.
So when you talked about it as well, and I was like, oh my God, he's been like through this journey, and there's like such a similarity because it kind of happened by quote unquote chance with you as well. Like you were not looking to do somatic work. It was
No,
a kind of quote unquote again random
but
thing. So
yeah, essentially, I got pushed into it because the pure divinity wanting to move into the physiology, and it wasn't
yep,
able to fully because there was some stuff in there still, and I was kind of using my usual approach with it, but it wasn't really helping. And
yeah,
then it's like started getting pushed, and these things kept showing up that were like, look
yeah.
at this, look at this, look at this, and it's like, oh, okay, I got the hint.
This is why it's I get so like excited when I meet people like yourself who talk about it because to me that's like my chat I changed the name of my channel because someone asked me, well, if you were just to describe in 2 words what your channel is about, and I was like, well, basically humanizing awakening. You know what I mean? It was like it literally came out like that. So I decided to change it because even the stuff that you're talking about, the Brahman, the post Brahman, like, people hear. I know now that like a lot of people hear Brahman and it's like at that when you go, they're like they don't want to hear anything about healing. They don't want to talk about like body and the energetic karma. Forget about it. Astrology, like
Yeah,
like
but
whatever.
they want to escape their life off into the
It,
spiritual.
yeah, and I'm like,
Yeah,
Why? What's the problem?" And but because I'm not versed in that knowledge of scriptures. I don't quite understand where they're coming from and why this is an issue in the first place. Because like
yeah.
everything's included.
I can say the one thing I can say about that though is a lot of stuff. There was the sage Shankara when he came along,
Hmm.
the monastic lifestyle had pretty much died out in India, and so
Hmm.
one of the things he did was he revived the monastic lifestyle. But then the pendulum kind of swung to the other extreme. It was also part of the issue was also we were in a dark age then, and so it was very difficult to make spiritual progress and be in the world. But what's happened is now that the age is rising, and it's no longer necessary to step out of the world to make spiritual progress. And maybe for a
Right.
retreat or whatever like that, but not as a
Yeah.
lifestyle. And most people are not suited to be monks. Very few. That's like 1% maybe of the population. And most people are supposed to be, in the world. And if it weren't for
Mm-hmm.
that, our species would have died out. We have to we have to be in the world and be householders and that. So there, but the renunciate became overemphasized, and so there's all this renunciate teaching, and people are trying to do these renunciate things like, oh, there's no person here, and the world's an illusion, and so I can ignore it and just kind of do my practices. And but yeah, but then as the texts say, that if you try to live the dharma of another, you fail at both, because you can't, if you're not if you don't have the constitution to be a monk, you're just going to detach yourself and be off in the woo-woo, and you're not going to integrate that. And inversely, you're not going to be successful as a householder if you ignore your responsibilities and role in society. So it's yeah, it's an important aspect. I went through a little of that myself. So one of Maharishi's books was had a section in the back that talked about the paths, the yogas of enlightenment, and people, like I mentioned, having a devotional phase, but being more analytical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we're all kind of a mixture, really. It's not like there's one thing or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But what I read in there was that if you were analytically oriented, you should follow the path of the monk, because distractions of the world will distract you from this analysis. And three of the four primary disciples of Shankara were of that nature. So I thought,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm supposed to be a monk, and I should look for a way to be to do that. But
Yeah.
there was zero support for that. And even when Maharishi started the monks program, I didn't get any support for going on that. And indeed ended up, that I indeed had a bunch of things to do related to being a householder and have a family, and
Yeah.
I have grandkids now and so on like that. So
I mean, I was kind of amazed as I was learning about scriptures and what the different traditions say, especially like I think what kind of baffled me a little bit was just not recognizing the cultural context and the fact that even language is evolving with culture as cultures evolve, and therefore meanings change. And therefore, that's why we have, for example, I don't know how many now, over 40 translations, interpretations of Bible, and each one claims to like know the truth and, all of that. And so
even worse is the Yoga Sutra. You can go into any spiritual bookstore and see 30 copies, and it's not half of them. There's just dozens and dozens of translated. It's a shorter book, and so it's one of the books that gets translated a lot. And yet,
Yeah, but like when you
uh,
say this, Susanna and I were also talking about it. It's almost like when you say this, it's like I think it's only intelligent and fair to like take that into account and not rely on any interpretation for the truth. Like I mean, just purely when you know that these cultures and contexts and language have been evolving, but like so many people will immediately conflate this with like disrespecting the tradition or disrespecting the knowledge or whatever, which is absolutely not true. But
the trick is it's what the ego wants to be certain. The ego wants
right,
certain, and
yeah,
so it looks for the truth, and then the truth becomes identified. In other words, it becomes part of our sense of a sense of self, is that we believe these things, that I'm this, I have this party, and I go to this church, and this. They become part of our identity. If you
yeah,
meet someone, what do they tell you? Oh, this is my name and this is what I do. And they're
yeah,
basically telling you their identity, and yet that's not who they are. That's just how they relate to it. But because
yeah,
it's part of their identity, when you say anything that threatens that, then they can get offended.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
you're basically they experience it as a threat to themselves.
to themselves. Yeah. David, so thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation about all the things somatics and body works and all sorts. Thank you.
Thank you.